which is to celebrate Jo and her amazing book that she's been working on for 5 years. I'm extremely proud to have been associated with it in the later stages of the 5 years. And I think it's an amazing and wonderful project. I think I was drawn to it because when I was young, I was a journalist in Vietnam. And I think what I found lasting memories of that time was what happened to the American soldiers and the way that their parallel stories to the wider horror of what happened to Vietnam itself. On the whole, those stories weren't told, except by the soldiers themselves, and mostly much later on. And a certain glorification of that war, which became, sort of mediatized, was so untruthful compared to what I knew about the soldiers. And I saw the same kind of phenomenon in other wars that I've worked on, like in Southern Africa, the white South African conscript soldiers were devastated by what the war actually was, as opposed to what they were told. And the same in anyone who's ever worked in Palestine knows the same about Israeli refuseniks soldiers. So when I first saw Jo's work, I thought she'd done this brilliant thing of listening to individuals who knew the texture of the Iraq War in a way that no journalist can ever convey. And that's by way of introduction, and she probably wants to talk in a completely different way about how she came to do this book and what it meant for her. So over to you, Jo.
Okay, thank you. That was a nice description. So yeah, that was I'd agree. I'm going to talk a bit about the book and show you some of the pictures from the book. So I guess if we could turn the lights off, it would make me feel more comfortable as well. So the book's only just been published and came back a few days ago. So I'll explain it to you and talk you through it, if that's okay. The project's essentially about individuals or soldiers that had moral doubts about their involvement in the Iraq War. And over a period of 5 years, I went back and forth to America and interviewed about 40 different soldiers. And I essentially was looking at what an individual does when they're contractually obliged to do something that they're morally opposed to. I came about the subject in a slightly skew-whiff way, and I was wanting to get into doing more documentary and TV documentary, and a friend of mine told me about a documentary that he was doing for Al Jazeera English called Saeed Faruqi, who's here today. And he was doing a TV project about conscientious objection within the US military. I'd heard about the phrase conscientious objection within terms of the First and Second World War, but I'd never heard of the term when there wasn't conscription. So I was kind of intrigued, but I was also slightly sceptical at why a soldier would need to apply for conscientious objection in a time where they'd willingly signed up to the military in the first place. So that's how the project started, and so I followed Saeed to meet a soldier called Robert, who had applied for conscientious objection. And this is Robert. When I took this picture, he was in hiding, or he'd gone AWOL and was lying low for a month. He'd joined the military and at age 19 been deployed to Iraq for 3 months. During that time, he'd applied for conscientious objection and his application had been denied. So when he came back off leave, he went AWOL. So when I took this photo, he knew that he was going to turn himself in within the month. He would most likely get court-martialed and was facing 3 years in prison for what he'd done. And so it was only when meeting Robert that it became much more real. It wasn't about a soldier not wanting to fight in a time of war. It fascinated me that someone so young, who wasn't on the front line, he was in Iraq, but he was a radio operator, so he wasn't sort of in direct danger, but his sense of moral conviction had brought him to the point that instead of doing something that he was totally against, he was willing to go to prison for 3 years for what he'd done. And so it sort of, at this point, the war had been going on for 5 years, and I had been very against the war in Iraq, but at no point had I ever considered how soldiers would have been feeling at a time when we'd gone to war and it had been a very unpopular war, and I'd never ever considered really soldiers as an individuals. And so seeing him and seeing his dilemma kind of made me want to question whether there were other soldiers feeling like he had. And so I started emailing and Googling and doing the usual research, and it was kind of, I was quite surprised to find that there were a lot of soldiers that had spoken out and not necessarily applied for conscientious objection, because most soldiers in the present day don't know that it's something that they can apply for. So a lot of people go AWOL, other people leak stuff to the media. So it was a sort of, I wanted to look at what soldiers were doing when they were contractually obliged to do something and they were morally feeling really awkward about what they were doing. So I started to collect quite a lot of stories, and every 6 months I'd go and I'd start meeting the people. This is one of the first people I met, and he'd got quite a lot of press because he'd become the first soldier to ever publicly refuse to be deployed to Iraq. He was in the Marine Corps, and he was court-martialed and imprisoned for 6 months. So at this point, I'm just going to sort of talk to you about the book as a whole and my process as a photographer, because this was the first time that I had been taking notes and interviewing people as well as photographing them. So as a photographer, I still shoot on film and I shoot on an old Hasselblad. So I would sort of sit and I'd meet with them and I would record as I was talking. And because of the process that I try to go through with photography, the same process was happening with the words. And I would get a lot more smaller bits of information, not just that he was a Marine or that he was in prison for 6 months, but all the side stories, all his doubts, his relationships with his families, his friends, the issues, the smaller issues that affected the big issue. And for a long time, almost 2-3 years into the project, I was doing the portraits, but I was compiling quite formal documentations of what they told me. And it was only when I struggled for a long time how to present the work. And it was only when I was kind of forced to present the work to someone that I went back to my sketchbooks and scanned them to show to people. And that was when it kind of clicked for me, and I felt that this was a much better way of telling the story, and I could add in other smaller parts to each person's story, add letters, objects, and it made it clear that this is the way that I should go with the project. So I kept going back and forwards for a very long time, it felt like, and all of the stories were very, very different, and I'd just like to talk to you about a few of them. This is Ryan Endicott. He was in the Marine Corps, and he was deployed to Iraq for 7 months. He wasn't a conscientious objector and didn't speak out at all whilst he was in the military. It was only when he was honourably discharged a year later that he decided to speak out about what he claims are the atrocities that he and his fellow soldiers committed whilst he was in Iraq. I don't particularly want to talk about his statement, and it is quite public and on YouTube. And the tattoo that he's done to himself, I feel, illustrates something of what he was talking about. It's a pair of hands, and it's got blood pouring out of it, and it says, "Forgive me, for I have sinned," along the bottom of his back. But what I want to read to you is some of the quotes from some of the soldiers, and this is one quote from from Ryan, and it's after he gave his public statement, it's the reactions that his friends and family had to his public testimony. After I made my public testimony, my brother disowned me on Facebook for everyone to see. He said that I was a traitor and that I wasn't his brother anymore, that I wasn't even a man. Every single person that I served with in the war found out about my testimony and have publicly said that I'm a liar, a bitch, that I'm full of shit, that I'm a fucking American, flag-burning, troop-hating communist. It literally broke my heart. I mean, I understand why a lot of these guys did what they did. They're not ready to accept that what we did was wrong, because it's hard. It's hard to accept that what you do, what you believe in, was wrong. And not wrong like 2 + 2 is 5 wrong, but like you fucking killed somebody and that's something you have to live with for the rest of your life. Some people just aren't ready to live with that yet. Every soldier that I interviewed for this project had very different stories, but there was very strong threads that led throughout the whole project. And one feeling that came up time and time again was that process of change in them, and believing in one thing and then having to sort of adjust to the situation they were in and trying to readdress how they were feeling about the situation. And it was something that was very, very hard for a lot of the soldiers to get to the point where they changed. This is Hart Vigis, who I photographed in Texas. He had joined the military as a direct response to 9/11, and in his own words said he wanted to go and liberate the Iraqi people and clean up what they hadn't finished off in the first Gulf War. And he deliberately joined the infantry paratroopers so that he could be on the front line. And from his own account was very gung-ho about it all. He told me a story which always stayed with me called "It's Not My Kill." He'd been in Iraq for quite a few months, and they'd had to pull to the side of the road because there'd been a dead body, and they had to sort of deal with the body. And whilst they were waiting for someone to collect it, the soldiers were taking turns at having trophy photos of the dead body. When Hart was asked if he wanted his photo taken with the body, he said, "It's not my kill," as in, if he'd have killed the person, he'd have been perfectly happy to have a trophy photo with that body. It was just because he hadn't killed that person. And so that was him sort of trying to illustrate to me how his mindset was at the time. And again, I'm just going to read you a quote from him. "When we got to Al Samara, our platoon was approached by a man who didn't have an ear. He was told that they took his ear because he wouldn't fight for Saddam, and thanked us. All through Al Samara, parts of Fallujah, and when we got to Baghdad, people were cheering, saying, 'Yes, Bush, no Saddam,' and it felt good. We were there to take care of the bad guy and give the country back to the people. But then we stayed. I was really confused when we were leaving and more troops were coming in. I thought we'd captured Saddam, we'd killed his sons, and I started to wonder why we were still there. That led me towards, a little thought, a little doubt. But pride is a tricky beast." Hart was deployed to Iraq for a year, and when he came back, he sort of had a huge turnaround that came out of nowhere, as he describes, and he just blurted it all out to his commander, who was extremely supportive and completely supportive of him, and suggested that he was a conscientious objector. He had no idea what a conscientious objector was, and the military supported him. He applied and was honourably discharged 10 months later. The other subject that came up consistently through interviewing the veterans was even if they felt uncomfortable with what they were doing, they had no idea what they were being instructed to do was whether it was legal or illegal or not. And as someone in the military, they often you become very unquestioning. So this was a theme that came up again and again with a lot of the soldiers. This is Sam Provence, who was the last soldier I photographed for this project, and kind of a very fascinating guy. He is a military intelligence officer, and he was deployed to Abu Ghraib for 3 months. And during this time, he began to see and witness things that he felt were wrong, but he didn't know whether they were illegal or not. So I'm just going to read you a quote from him. This one's about his experience of interviewing a detainee. He was 16, just a kid, scared to death and skinny as a rail. We went out to get him from general population area to interrogate him. The general population area was right next to the questioning booth, but they still wanted me to put one of those sacks over his head and transport him. It wasn't like a normal sack. It was a plastic sandbag all covered in sand. It barely fit over his head, and he was shaking as I put it over him. We used it so he couldn't see where we were taking him, even though we could see the booth from where we were standing. We had to cuff him too, but his wrists were so skinny you couldn't put the handcuffs on him, so he just kind of carried them instead. I felt so rotten. The weirdest thing was when we went into the room with the kid, and the military intelligence guy came in and gave the interrogating officer a handful of Jolly Rancher sweets. It was meant to be put on the table like, if you talk, we'll give you some Jolly Ranchers. The kid knew nothing. He was just this guy's son. Originally, we were supposed to interrogate his father, a general in Saddam's regime, which is why I had agreed to be part of it. But then, when we got there, they told us that he'd already been broken, and as a sort of consolation prize, we were told we could interrogate his son. I only found out afterwards what they had done to break his father. His son had been doused in cold water, driven around in a truck in the freezing cold, and covered in mud. I guess at the same time, his father was being interrogated elsewhere, and from what I understand, they told him that they'd take a break and that they'd let him see his son. So the general's there thinking he's going to see his son and have some kind of reunion with him, but instead they just allowed him to see his son naked, shivering, and covered in mud. A lot of people will probably wonder why I didn't say anything publicly right away, but it would have been pointless. Even though I thought what was happening was wrong, doesn't mean that it was illegal anyway. Sam did speak out when the Abu Ghraib scandal came out. He decided to publicly speak out. His commanders on every level told him he was absolutely forbidden to speak. He felt that there was a cover-up and that the military police and a few bad apples were being claimed for what he felt was on a much higher level and much more systematic. So he came to the conclusion that he should speak out and gave an interview with ABC News. He was demoted and brought down to the lowest rank, and his military clearance was taken off him. And a few years later, he was discharged out of the military. The evidence that he gave was taken really seriously and was taken further with other organisations. But I want to end with Sam because he's pretty extraordinary, completely believes in the military and has the utmost respect for it, but just felt what was happening in the time that he was there was wrong and that it needed to be changed. And as a civilian, and I have no military background, it was something that came up again and again, that as civilians we are taught to question. In the military you don't question, and it's very, very difficult to think differently and to question what you're being expected of you. So I was just going to end with a quote from Sam, which is this. I went completely against the ethics of a soldier that I had and still have, because that's something you don't do, disobey your commander. That's the definition of a soldier, someone who follows orders. That's what you're trained to do, whether you like it or not. You may be ordered to your death, but you have to follow that order. But I also felt that I had been tested as a person, and that I would have failed the test if I hadn't spoken out. it was a once-in-a-lifetime decision. So I'd love to talk to you about all of the soldiers, and each story is precious to me as the next one, but I've got to keep it short, so I thought I'd end with Sam. So.
Well, thank you so much, Jo. That was so interesting. Now, when Jo was doing her research, she found it very difficult to find British soldiers who would speak in the same way as the American soldiers that she's shown you here. But actually, she did find one. The first one she found is with us tonight, and it's Ben, who was a member of the SAS and was in Iraq, and now he works in the ambulance service. And I don't want to say more about him. I think he's an amazing person, and I want him to tell you a bit about his experience. Ben.
Thanks, Victoria, and thanks, Jo, for inviting me here to speak tonight. And thanks also for this amazing book, which in my own opinion is a study in resistance from within the military. Resistance from within the military comes in many ways. You've got the classic example of the person applying for conscientious objector status. You've also got people who refuse to deploy to certain combat zones. Whilst they're in those zones, people who refuse to patrol or refuse to shoot at people, refuse to follow certain orders. And the people who are in this book have got, all got different stories and different forms of resistance. And the punishment handed out to these people is different too, and that I haven't quite got to the bottom of that one, but I think that all depends a lot on what their CO, what their commanding officer thinks about the person and their own attitude towards the war. You've got people who spent a long time in prison because they've refused to deploy to Iraq, and then you've got people, as Jo showed in the previous slide, who were discharged with glowing references. But I think the most important point to make about this resistance is that of all the guys I've met, and I've met a few of these American guys, and I've met guys in Britain as well, this is not about being scared. This isn't about worrying about your own predicament, the fear of being killed or injured. This is, on the whole, all of the guys I spoke to, this is about being morally opposed to doing it to other people, morally opposed to shooting people, morally opposed to killing people, to torturing people, to dragging them out of their houses in the middle of the night. So I want to sort of make that point because I think it's important. It's too easy. The media likes to portray these people as cowards or, scared, and that's not the case. Also, resistance within the military has a long history, going back centuries. Just a few examples. In the Civil War on the Gettysfield battlefield, when they dug up the rifles from that battlefield over 100 years later, they found that most of the rifles had 4, 5, 6, 7 rifle bullets, the balls, the musket balls that they used back in those days, loaded into the rifles. And what these guys have been doing is they'd been going through the process of loading their rifles, but refusing to actually shoot at the enemy. During the Vietnam War, there were thousands of cases of resistance, from guys refusing the draft, running across the border into Canada, from guys refusing to deploy to Vietnam. And whilst in Vietnam, there were literally thousands of men who refused to kill the enemy, refused to go out on patrol, formed unofficial truces with the enemy so this resistance has a long history, and that history continued into Iraq. But this story is hidden. The military don't want us to know about it. The government certainly don't want us to know about it. And so that's why we don't know a lot about these guys, and we don't know a lot about the guys in Britain who've done similar things. There are only 4 people I know of from within the British military who've refused to deploy in the wars against Iraq and Afghanistan. Myself and an RAF doctor called Malcolm Kendall-Smith, who was sent to prison for 9 months, both refused to continue to deploy to Iraq. And Joe Glenton and Michael Lyons. Joe Glenton was a Royal Logistics soldier, and Michael Lyons was a submariner, and they both refused deployment to Afghanistan and were given 9 months in prison each. I think there's probably been more cases of resistance from within the British military, but as in my own case, I was released from the military without any punishment, and my case didn't become public, and I think there might be tens or maybe up to the 100 mark of people who have refused to fight in Iraq and Afghanistan. But I've been invited tonight to sort of bring one of these people into the room and share with you a few of my own experiences. As a child, I was indoctrinated into the sort of the idea that Britain was a great country and that our military did noble things. You know, I remember asking my granddad to show me his medals from the Second World War, and sitting and watching the armistice parades and watching war movies, reading all these comic books about sort of commando actions in the Second World War. And I joined the Army Cadets when I was 13, and I really became sort of dedicated to becoming a soldier. I saw it as the ultimate way to serve your country, would be to fight for your country in the army. And when I was 19, I joined the parachute regiment, and I was, for all intents and purposes, a career soldier. I served in the parachute regiment for 6 years. I did 3 tours of Northern Ireland, a tour of Macedonia and a tour of Afghanistan, all in what the military would describe as low intensity or counter-insurgency operations. And in 2003, I decided to apply to join the Special Air Service, and I became a member in 2003 and deployed to Iraq in 2005. And I suppose my thoughts about going to Iraq before I went there were pretty cynical about the whole thing, but as a professional soldier, this was another chance to prove myself, another chance to experience conflicts. Even though I was pretty cynical about the reasons we were there, I didn't really have any doubts about going there. However, whilst I was in Iraq, what I experienced over there was completely different to what I'd experienced previously in previous conflicts. Part of that was because I was deployed within an American unit in Baghdad and was working for the first time directly with Americans rather than within a British chain of command. And also because of the type of operations that we were actually carrying out there. My task was to, along with my fellows, was to detain what were called high-value targets. And we would go out in the night time and use explosives to smash our way into people's homes in the middle of the night whilst they were asleep. We would get in there, where these places would be dark and full of dust, and the first thing we'd do is split the families up into men in one room, women and children in the other room, sort of roughly take them around, and then the interrogations would start of the males. And whilst the interrogations were being undertaken, one of my jobs was to search the house for mobile phones, computers, money, weapons, and we'd gather all this up, usually within half an hour maybe, and then take all of these possessions of this family and the males and take them back to our base, where they'd be handed through a chain into a detention facility. And at first doing this, we were led to believe that these people we were after were, these high-value targets, these sort of really dangerous terrorists. But it soon became apparent to me and my colleagues that these weren't terrorists at all. These were, normal civilians. Yes, we found the odd weapon in people's houses, but that's normal in Iraq. It was a very dangerous country at the time. People had these weapons to protect their families from armed robberies and kidnappings and all the rest of it. And over a period of months, while we were continuously doing this, I became completely disillusioned with this. The way that we were rounding these people up, I thought the intelligence we were getting was flawed, and that the people we were detaining weren't the people that we were really after. And also I was concerned about what was happening to these people once we'd hand them over to the Americans. And I suppose it can all be summed up in when my commanding officer came out to visit us in a room much like this and stood in front of us and said that he was worried that we were becoming the secret police of Baghdad. And I thought, everything I'd grown up believing, that Britain was this good country, that we'd fought the Nazis, that we were always the good guys and they were always the bad guys. But in this situation, it was us. We were the people doing the bad stuff. We were even living in the houses that used to be lived in by Saddam's henchmen. And we were doing things that Saddam had been accused of before we invaded. I was sent home on some leave after being there for a few months, and whilst I was home on leave and I had that distance from my comrades and distance from what was going on in Iraq, I contemplated this every day, what was I doing? What was I doing taking part in this? And I came to the conclusion every day that I couldn't continue to do this. So I asked for an interview with my CO, and I went into the office and spoke to the clerk, and he said, "Oh, what are you here for?" And I said, "Oh, I want an interview with the CO." And he goes, "Is this about leaving?" I thought, wow, has he sort of read my mind or something? Over the next week, or quite a few weeks, I was interviewed by 5 different officers, and they were trying to get to the bottom of why I wanted to leave, and I made 2 commitments. One was that I was refusing to deploy to Iraq, and 2, that I was refusing to serve under American command, and that was what I told them. And I sort of said, right, this is my position. You know, you're going to have to do what you think is the right thing. And I thought I was going to end up being jailed, but on the whole, people were very compassionate with me. All of the officers that interviewed me had been there and seen what was going on, and whilst they probably didn't agree with my own action, I think they could understand why I was doing it. In fact, the only person who didn't agree with me was the chaplain, who made some comment about how people were scared on the way down to the Falklands and tried to get out of it. And it's funny because in other guys I've spoken to in the British military and in the American military, it's often the chaplain that has been the most critical of these guys. My good friend Michael Lyons, who spent 9 months in prison for refusing to go to Afghanistan, applied for conscientious objector status, and it was turned down when the chaplain wrote a report saying that because he was of no faith, he couldn't possibly conscientiously object to a war, which is just amazing. So I'd gone from being a career soldier in Iraq, and within a week of being back, immediately after returning, I never put on a uniform again, I never held a rifle again, and within 3 months I was discharged from the army. And I think that would have been the end of the story but I started to get this amazing sense of duty to tell people about what was really going on in Iraq. And I started to speak at public meetings and speak to the media, and it was then that I started to get into trouble, and I got called in for meetings with the Ministry of Defence, and they said, you know, you've had your fun, you need to stop talking about all this. And that went on for a while, and I continued to speak at public meetings until 2008, when the government was trying to defend the British position in regards to rendition and torture, and they were trying to tell the British population that the only involvement we had was in an island called Diego Garcia, where a few of these torture victims had gone through. And I was sat there thinking, and it's strange because when you're in the army, when you're in Iraq, you're only seeing a very small part of what's a much bigger war, and you're only seeing your small part of it. And it was only afterwards, really, thinking about these things and reading about how the rest of the war was working, that I realised that the guys that we were picking up were ending up in these secret prisons and being mistreated by the Americans. And so I made a public statement about this, about how, of course, we were involved. If you're taking the people out of the houses in the first place, then you're directly involved in what happens to them afterwards. And as a result of that, I was taken to the High Court and given a lifetime injunction. Prevents me from speaking about anything I know as a result of my service. And I suppose that's my story about what happened, really, I suppose. And like Jo said, there are many different stories, many different outcomes, but I think the thread that runs through them all is a moral objection to what's going on, seeing a moral bankruptcy in what is being done in these countries, and whether these guys run away or face up to the military or go to prison or get discharged, that's the thread that runs through all these stories, and I think they're important stories that people need to hear, because too often people think that soldiers are robots and they just do as they're told, and that that we get a very sanitised view of what war is really like. I speak in schools a lot, and most kids' idea of what a war about is what they see in these computer games, Call of Duty and games like that. And so it's important that these stories are told, that people realise that war isn't like what we're told on the TV and what we see in these games. And so I'd like to thank Jo again for this extraordinary piece of work that she's made. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm sure there are lots of people who would like to ask questions of Jo and of Ben. Can I just see a few hands? And we've got a roving mic. So when you take the mic, can you just say who you are before you ask your question?
Hey, my name is Jim. Probably shouldn't be the first question. It's way, way, way too heavy. But it seems to me completely fundamental to everything we're talking about. It's a question. Sorry, was it Joe?
Ben.
Ben. Sorry. The question is, why do you think U.S. and U.K. Why were we in these wars? What was the point of them?
Yeah, I mean that's a big question with a
Why do all the fighting?
with a massive answer. I mean, my own opinion on it is that that Britain and America are basically an empire, and that fighting wars is what empires do. But a more detailed answer would be that, you know, that there are vested interests in these wars. Politicians, the media, corporations, especially arms companies, and the military all have a vested interest in fighting these wars. And it's not as contrived as some people might think, but when you've got so many powerful groups that want to go to war, then war becomes inevitable. And that's why we're in these wars. I mean, the war in Iraq, I think, is pretty straightforward. You know, it's about controlling the oil supply. You know, that's a straightforward one. The war in Afghanistan, a bit more complex. But what I do know is once you start these wars, for whatever reason you give in the first place, those reasons usually change. So you might go to Iraq to find WMD, and then you're there for regime change, and then you're there to set up democracy. And you might go to Afghanistan to find Al-Qaeda, and then it becomes something about getting rid of the Taliban, then it's about women's rights, you know. And these are just people just clutching at straws to give you a reason why we're there.
And that's very disconcerting. That's something that did come up with a lot of soldiers. And so the people that went in at first were there to look for weapons of mass destruction, and that's what their job was, and that's what they risked their lives doing. And as time went on, they were having to deal with the fact that they were looking for something that didn't exist, and those were the issues that kept coming up again and again. And then it was there to sort of give back freedom to the Iraqi people. And so when the rules kept changing, that was really, really disconcerting to a lot of the soldiers out there, and that came up a lot.
So I think one of the themes that comes out of what you've spoken about previously and a lot of the stories is that people felt that they'd been lied to, that they had gone genuinely, and then when they saw the realities, they felt they'd been betrayed by their political superiors. And I think that's quite an important...
But just to expand on that, it goes deeper than that. It's not just about being lied to about a particular war. In my own case and in other people I've spoken to, it's about a realisation that everything you've grown up believing is a lie. You know, we are not the good guys. We do not do good things to people. And that is a much more fundamental realisation that can be, you know, sort of mind-blowing, can be really devastating to have to confront.
We've got one here, two at the back, and one there. Can we hold those in our minds?
Hi. Thanks, Jo, for a very personal and also heartbreaking piece of journalism, and Ben for your bravery, your commitment. Jo, did you feel like any of the stories were disingenuous when you were interviewing people?
It's tricky. The movement in America is much bigger than here, and so there are organisations that a lot of the soldiers join, and they definitely had people that they then had to sort of slightly push out of the organisation because they were in there for the wrong reason. So there was a very small, very, very small amount of people that I didn't have complete faith in what they were saying. And most of the soldiers, they, like Ben pointed out, they had so much courage, and so many of them, there was no fear of going to war. That wasn't the case. And a lot, I don't know, 50% of the soldiers carried on fighting and resisted in other ways and refused to carry a weapon or do some sort of resistance to sort of to get a balance within themselves about what they were doing and sort of morally sort of justify it in their own head. So no, there was a few people that I didn't put in the book, and it was for a mixture of reasons. But yeah, most of the people all of the people that I put in the book, I have was very, very sincere. And so yeah, if that was your question.
I you, panel. My name is Kate. I'm a master's student of conflict at the LSE. My question is for Ben. Just one of the conflicts that we would study now is Northern Ireland. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So a lot of the things that you mentioned that you came to see about your time in Iraq, internment, maltreatment of prisoners, let's say, innocent people being caught up in the whole net, and that's all come to light to now be part of the Northern Ireland conflict. And I'm wondering, is your perception of the Iraqi war maybe down to the place that you were in your career or your age, or do you see the two terms in your career as very, very different?
When I first left the army, my only objection was to the war in Iraq. I actually told my CEO I'd be quite happy to go to Afghanistan, but it was decided that they couldn't have a soldier in the unit picking and choosing which wars they went to, you know. But over time, with distance from the army and, you know, thinking about these things, Northern Ireland was very similar to Iraq. It was just at a different stage. And in fact, at the time I thought, oh, what did I do in Northern Ireland? I patrolled around the countryside for 6 months at a time. I didn't shoot anyone. I didn't hit anyone. I didn't really have anything to do with the civilian population, really. What was the harm in that? But if you think about it, imagine how that feels if you're the local population and you've got guys, aggressive young men who look aggressive, who are just waiting, just dying for you to pick up a weapon so they've got a reason to shoot you. Imagine how much that must feel, having that presence in your community. And so, even though to us it seemed very tame, I'm sure to the people that we were doing this to, this wasn't tame at all. This was highly intimidating. So yeah, at the time I did see them as different, but from you know, looking at it now, I see the similarities between the two conflicts.
Jo, thank you. My name's Kate. Your photographs show real sensitivity and insight, and I can't wait to buy your book. I just wanted to ask Ben a question with regard to post-traumatic stress disorder and how the British military deal with that on the kind of general level, but also for officers and guys that work in those teams, or whatever you call them. Sorry, I don't have the vocab, but and then also in the SAS and the SBS and all of that, and sometimes when people aren't aware that they have it, how colleagues will bring it up sensitively with them. Thank you.
Sure. When I first got out of the army, a very good mate of mine said, "Oh, you know, you've probably got PTSD." And I said, "Well, no, I haven't. I feel fine." He goes, and he'd been to the Falklands, and he said, "If you've gone to one of these conflicts and you come back without PTSD, you're a psychopath." There's the most recent sort of theories in this, and they are all theories, you know, is that there's something called a moral injury. So previously, people thought that PTSD was caused by being in a life-threatening situation, seeing people killed, you know, seeing bodies and all this sort of other stuff. But the most recent studies in America believe that it's something called a moral injury. When you're involved or see something that you find that you morally disagree with, that can cause severe injury to the mind, having to cope with that afterwards and having to deal with that, and how do you respond to that? In terms of within the military, I never saw anything within the military where anyone suspected anyone had PTSD. I think it's definitely something that comes out after you leave. And I think the reason for that may be that the military, and maybe not by contrivance, just by luck, has found over centuries a way of dealing with this at the time. So you've got that strong sense of brotherhood within the military. You're constantly around people. There's a culture of drinking in the military as well. And I think these problems don't actually become obvious until after these conflicts. That's my own belief in it.
Yes?
Jo, an amazing set, and the commitment to actually follow this over a period of time, going to the States and so on, I understand. My name is Carol Story, and I'm a photojournalist. Ben, this is a dual question for you. The first is when the introduction was made about you, is that unlike the Americans, where there's been a broad profiling, as is reflected in Jo's book, that there are very few Brits that have come forward to discuss and express how they have felt being totally against the war. And it's curious that when Tim Hetherington had gone to Afghanistan for 18 months, and Restrepo, if any of you are familiar with it, I asked him, because I know him very well, I asked him, why were you with the Americans? Why were you embedded with Americans? You can easily be embedded, you're Brit. And he said, because the Americans would allow me to see things and photograph that the Brits would not. So that's one part. And the second is what you just said earlier, which I found, and you perhaps illuminate that, rather, I think, cynical, in that we are the bad guys. Would you say that we were the bad guys when we entered World War II and saw the absolute atrocities that Hitler was instigating at that time? Was it correct for us to be in that war? Why are wars fought, aside from the commercial reasons? And as you rightly say, certainly the arms dealers are the greatest benefactors of all wars in today's world. Yeah. So those two questions for you.
It's interesting. Whenever I give a speech and I mention politicians, the arms companies, the media, and the military, people always come back and say, "Oh, well, of course it's about the arms companies," and they always leave out the other three. And maybe that's, usually because it's people in the media or military people or politicians, and they don't like to be sort of complicit in that. The Second World War, the problem with any war, when it's described to us by politicians, is that they always focus on the immediacy. So Saddam Hussein is about to launch these weapons of mass destruction. There's no discussion about how Saddam Hussein might have acquired these weapons of mass destruction, about how we backed this guy, about how we backed them in the war in Iran. And the same can be said about World War II. And I direct you towards a speech by an American historian called Howard Zinn on what he calls the three sacred wars of America that cannot be questioned: the Civil War, the War of Independence, and the Second World War. We forget when we talk about the Second World War our cynical nature about it. And I know this is not going to be popular, but this was not some fight for freedom. Get that out of your head. This was not some fight for freedom. When we entered the war in 1940 to defend Poland, right, that we had no way of defending, we sat in France and waited and sat there. We could have invaded Germany, we didn't. Do you know why? Because we hoped that Germany would push through Poland and carry on into Russia. Throughout the Second World War, we were hoping that Germany would destroy Russia, and to help him along in that, rather than invading Europe in 41 or 42 or 43, we invaded North Africa to get our hands on the, so, I mean, I could go on about this for ages, and there's lots written about it, but World War II is not a noble war. I found out recently when I was researching this that that when we discovered the Jews not discovered because we knew about it anyway, when we liberated the concentration camps, we kept those people in those concentration camps for another year. Another year. Dwight Eisenhower is quoted as saying that the only difference between us and the Nazis is that we didn't kill them. So, there's a lot of rubbish talked about the Second World War. I grew up believing all this, So no, the Second World War wasn't a good war.
So you don't think it ended all the tyranny? There's 6 million Jews and sympathetic whoever have murdered, and you think that something should not have been done to fall?
Well, let's take this back a bit further. Let's look at the Second World War, the true causes of the Second World War, which goes back to the First World War. Without the First World War, there is no Second World War. Without Versailles, there is no Adolf Hitler. Who put Versailles in place? We did. Who started the First World War? A series of empires, the British, the French, the Germans, the Russians, all interested in furthering their imperial powers. This leads to the Second World War, and like I say, it's easy to pick up on these things. It's easy to say, what about Saddam killing the people in Halabja? That was 15 years before. We didn't do anything about it at the time. These are just excuses for war, and we're not going to agree on this. So,
I'm actually going to stop us going too far down the World War II route, because I think we want to stay close to the book and the specific nature of the work that Jo has done, and the exact experience that that Ben has brought you. And at this point, Ben, you may not be able to see, he's wearing a shirt which is has written on the pocket, Veterans for Peace. And there's a second former British soldier here tonight who's also in Veterans for Peace. And I'd just like Adnan to just very briefly tell us why you're in Veterans for Peace and a little bit about your experience and your reaction to the book.
Hello. Hello. Yeah. Sorry, can I just take it back to the Second World War for a second?
Only if it's a second, or I shall stop you at once.
I know, absolutely. But me and Ben were in Oxford recently, and somebody brought up the case of the Nazis and the Holocaust. And I've been to Auschwitz and Birkenau, and the reason I went there was because the British Army took me there. And the British Army took me there to say, look at the horrific stuff that happened here. And we all agreed it was absolutely horrific. But when something like that happens, and this is a wider case about whether you should fight for Queen and country, etc., when something like that happens, you'll feel it in your stomach. You know, and I'm sure there's loads of people here willing to get up and fight that kind of tyranny. That's not the kind of thing that was going on in Iraq, where I served twice. And I was one of the first troops to invade Iraq because my sergeant major, sorry, Ben, my sergeant major came to me and said, "You speak Arabic, don't you?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Why not?" I said, "Because I'm from Burnley." And he said, "Well, I've told the US Marines you're going to be translating for them." So I went forward with the US Marines and translated as best I could. But me and Ben met at the Duke of York's Theatre, where I'd written something called The Absurdity of War. And we read some pieces, and I met Ben there. And I said something to him when I was drunk in Oxford, and he didn't really believe me, but it's the truth. When I met Ben, I was very inspired, and I was an absolutely willing soldier. You know, I've just written a book which I don't want to publicise too much, but there'll be a book coming out about how I felt and how young men actually feel about going to war. And it's not a family show, is it? And I think it just kind of did come down to the fact that I'm a man, and I had these really young adolescent feelings about things. So anyway, why did I join Veterans for Peace? I met Ben, and he said, "Hey, do you want to come and save the world?" And I thought that was a pretty good thing to do, you know. And if you're still, you know, talking about the grey line, it is grey. You know, it's not black and white, guys. But while you're still trying to make your mind up, you might as well be sat in the peace camp, because it's a nice place to be. So while you're trying to make your mind up, don't be on the side of the people with the guns. So that's why I joined Veterans for Peace. And the more I've read, and I found it fascinating that Ben and I were both rankers, and we weren't officers, but you can quiz us as much as you like.
Just explain the difference between officers and rankers, because most of us...
Yeah, so Ben and I both joined at the bottom. You know, every year I was in the military, somebody said to me, "Are you sure you don't want to be an officer?" You know, I was like, "No, you're all right." And that was just simply because, and like Ben, I was fascinated by doing the job on the ground, and I was the guy kicking the doors in, and I had a group of men with me in Iraq that could do that. So they were the feelings that it's a process of reprogramming, really. You leave the military and you start trying to look at different things, and you know, there's still that competition. As you know, because I'm male, I think I'll go to the grave with that. But I do, you know, use a competition in other ways now. But yeah, anyway, hello.
Thank you very much, Adnan. Can I see any more hands? Okay, could we have this one here, and then one there?
Hi, my name is Jessie, and your project was a big inspiration on work I did as well. And I was just wondering how you decided when it was finished, when there's so many stories to tell and so much depth to every single one.
It was quite interesting, because as I started to meet different soldiers, as I said before, there was this similar subjects that were coming up, but every experience was very different. And I wanted to sort of get a cross-section of all the subjects that in the last 10 years have come up, haven't been experienced in other wars. And so things like WikiLeaks, going AWOL, claiming asylum in different countries. So I kind of wanted to, through the book, explore lots of different subjects, and so much heavier subjects that would look at resistance as a whole. So I sort of wanted to get the balance right between not repeating the same story over and over again, and get as much as a factual document as possible. And I worked with 2 other people on the project, and a researcher that helped me a lot with the project who's here tonight. And so we want it to be a document, a factual document, and there's a sort of back section which has a lot of information about it. So although I wanted to tell each person's story, they were there chosen for very specific reasons to cover the subjects that have been brought up over the last 10 years. So I came to a point where I couldn't quite stop, and then realised that most of the subjects had been covered. So that was how.
Thank you.
This in the middle of yes, please.
Hi. Sorry. Question for Ben. Could you tell us a little bit more about the injunction that
Yeah,
the
sure.
injunction that you're under?
Yeah, so in 2008, at the behest of the British government at the time, and I later found out the American military, I was taken to the High Court on the Strand, and during a secret trial that no one was allowed inside, I was given a lifetime injunction that says I'm not supposed to talk about anything I know about as a result of my service.
So what happened now? Yeah.
How do you mean?
While you're talking.
Because I have a...
What are the consequences?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose every time I speak, I'm in contempt of court. But my duty is not to that court, I have a sense that I have a moral duty to tell people how it is, and I'm not going to be, obeying that injunction. So.
But it was something that at the time was really serious, and
Yeah.
You didn't take it lightly. When we first met, it was a big.
Yeah.
a
So
big
for the
thing in
first
people's lives.
3 years, first 2.5, 3 years, I actually 2.5 years, I stuck to the injunction, and I actually became quite ill in a sort of PTSD kind of way. Got very depressed, and I was drinking a lot, and I was thinking about Iraq a lot and all the rest of it, and I decided that that maybe what was causing the illness to be worse was that I had this duty to speak, and that I shouldn't be. For me, not speaking is worse than, say, spending a couple of months in prison or whatever, and it's not even a choice in a way, I just feel that I'm obligated. I feel obligated to do that.
It was interesting. Out of all of the American soldiers that I interviewed, none of them have a gagging order. It's only the British government that stops.
Exactly.
There. Yeah.
Sorry, can I ask one more question? Is that something that they can keep?
Hang on. Let's wait till you get the mic.
Sorry. Is that something that they can keep you because you joined the army, or is that something that they can just keep to anyone? Or?
No, I mean, unfortunately, when I joined Special Forces, I signed something called a confidentiality contract, which was originally drawn up to stop people from writing Bravo 20 and the one that got away, these books that these people made a lot of money out of, and actually, I'm not sure why they stopped it, because it made the SES look a lot better than it really is, and I suppose so they brought in this confidentiality agreement, and then when I started to speak out, this was a handy device to silence me. So that's why other British soldiers haven't been gagged as well. It's people who signed this contract,
So it was specific to the SAS part of the experience, rather than the. Yes, I thought that was right. Have we got any more? Yes, several. Let's go here because she's close to the mic.
Hi,
And then there's one here and one here.
hi, my name's Michaela with a very practical, possibly boring question, but for Jo, for you, about did you go to a publisher? How did you support yourself through what sounds like quite an expensive exercise?
Yes, I have a publisher called Dowie Lewis, who's a photography specialist. But Victoria's just brought up Ellum, who came to me about. I was flip-flopping with this project for a long time and working it on my own, and a friend who's a producer sort of stepped in 3 years into the project when there was not an end in sight, and I just kept going back and forth, and sort of took control of the situation.
I just wanted Elham to say a few words, because there's such a big gap between doing all this work and turning it A, into an actual book, and B, finding ways of telling people about it and organising evenings like this. And as I've been kind of alongside for quite a while, I know what an amazing role Elham has played. So I wanted to say a wee bit about how difficult it's been and how successful in the end.
Well, I think like the main work is obviously.
Put the mic close to your mouth.
I think when I first met Jo, she was working on this project. That was about 5 or 6 years ago, and about 2 or 3 years ago, I started asking her, well, what are you doing with it? And she was going back and forth, and she just had so much. She was investing so much time into it, and I just felt like something has to happen with it. It has to all come together. And this year is quite significant because it marks a decade since the invasion of Iraq, and that felt like a really good kind of marker in a sense. And I mean, really what I did was just become part of a team working on something, and often when you're working on a big project alone, that's something that can just really motivate you and help you to push things forwards. And I mean, to keep going back and forth to the US is a really big thing to do. It's huge country, to find one individual person in Texas, and then there's another one in LA, and I mean, there's a logistical side of things, but there's also just a kind of motivational side of things. So that was pretty much my role, and we've worked as a team, but obviously, and then bringing on, say, Sarah to work as a researcher on it. So I think that was really the role that I had, to kind of make sure that it happened, but obviously the work is all down to Jo.
Thank you very much. Why don't you take the mic as you are ready with a question?
Actually, it's a question for both of you. Did you find, Jo, when you were shooting Ben, in your wide experience, that this almost relates to an age thing? Quite a lot of your soldiers are under a certain age, let's say. I don't know what your experience has been of the guys and girls that are in Veterans for Peace, Marines. I don't think he would even know what conscientious objective status is, and so I just wondered if that was something that you guys found parallels with.
You can go first. You probably know more.
So what was the actual? Yeah, I can hear you. Was it about that there's a theme of ages?
Yes.
Yes, loosely, yes.
What, in terms of
Speaking out.
Being more likely to take conscientious objection or to make
right?
the kind
Okay.
of
I mean,
moves
I suppose the most obvious thing is that the military is full of young people, so proportionally they're going to be the younger people who speak out, and also once you've been in the military for a certain amount of time, and I know lots of guys who resisted in one way or another in Iraq, but they were never going to leave the military because they had too much invested in it. Even if they thought the war in Iraq was completely wrong and that their part in it was completely wrong, they've got a wife, they've got a mortgage, they've got all these commitments, and they've only got a few years to go until they get their pension. So you're less likely to do it. You've invested too much, and you can see the light at the end of the tunnel. When you're younger, there's a lot more distance to that light at the end of the tunnel, so you're more likely to do it as well. And a lot of these guys, it would have been their first or 1 or 2 deployments, probably more likely to do it then.
It was interesting. Obviously, the younger ones, and this happened a lot, that they'd sign up at 17 and get their parents to give them permission and go in on their 18th birthday. And so then 2-3 years later, it wasn't unusual. It's not unusual for an 18-year-old to have completely different opinions to how they were when they were 21. And so that was something that they often had to deal with, that they'd signed a contract. And so a lot of them fell into that category. And then, like Ben says, as they got older, a lot of the more senior ones were harder to access, not willing to speak. So there were a few. There was a lawyer that I spoke to, but he wasn't prepared to go on record. And then there's 2 other sort of slightly older ones. But obviously, the more senior you get, it's much harder to speak out. Both because of the repercussions from the military, but also mentally as well. So.
There's this gentleman fairly sort of in the middle there. Maybe you've changed your mind, or maybe I missaw. Then, please.
Hi, I'm Ellie. I'm from IWM Imperial War Museum, so I'm looking at it from a very educational point of view, so slightly different to everybody else. My question is for both of you, and it's about the impact that you think this book and your talks are going to have on people's image of the military now. I mean, I know Britain, we have a very good image at the minute, especially with the Olympics and the Jubilee. You know, its media has really hyped up the military, and there's a lot of hero persona and things like this. Is this book and is your talk going to change that image? Do you think there's going to be more of an impact, especially now that we're coming out of Afghanistan? Are we going to forget about the military as it were? Is it going to come out about these kind of stories? And what kind of impact that would have on people, you know, the general civilians' image of the military?
Unfortunately, there's a huge media operation that has been in place for well over 100 years to make sure that we all think that our military are great and that everything they do is great and that all the wars we fight in are great. And as an example of that, in 2014 we're going to start to see this ramped up to celebrate 100 years since the start of the First World War. Well, that's something to celebrate, isn't it? And so things like this book and, you know, veterans speaking out against these wars and speaking about these wars do have a limited impact because, you know, we're 40 blokes, you know, with a very small website against a huge media operation, and, you know, this book is on a shelf with 100 books that are promoting the military. So it's a difficult place to be in, but it's important that we continue this work, you know, because there are people who benefit from this. For example, Michael Lyons, a young Navy medic, he joined the Navy after seeing an advert where the Navy rescued people off a volcano, and he thought, oh wow, that looks like a really good job, I can get involved in that. And he became a medic, and for the first 5 years of his service, he served on a submarine in the Indian Ocean, giving people paracetamol and things like that on the submarine, and checking to make sure that no one was getting too much radiation. He then received orders to deploy to Afghanistan to an infantry patrol base to act as a medic. This guy, you know, he'd never signed up for that. He'd never even thought of that. He didn't even think this was a possibility. And because he didn't know anything about the war in Afghanistan, because it wasn't on his radar, not interested, he thought he'd better start to educate himself. And he was lucky enough that at the time a young American soldier named Bradley Manning had leaked a huge amount of material called the Afghan War Diaries, all about Afghanistan. And Mike read all this and also read about what was going on in Iraq and saw the collateral murder video and decided that he couldn't deploy to that war. And as a result of that, he refused and he was given 9 months to prison. So all these small acts, you never know who they're going to affect, but I'm sure they affect someone.
Yeah.
I don't know particularly if I had an intention. And Ben and I have mutual respect for each other, and I've learnt a lot of Ben, but I definitely have a slightly different agenda because I'm not part of the military. So I don't really have a conclusion. It was just something that in my lifetime, the Iraq War was very significant, and it opened up something to a whole generation of people like me who were against the war. But if you're against something but you've signed a contract and you've put your life in the hands of your government, and then your government do something that you don't agree with, how do you deal with that? And so I was digging up questions, I think, more than giving us all a game plan. So I don't know, but there isn't really an answer in each person. Each person has a different opinion in this book, and they would argue if they were all put in the same room. It's just to show how complicated it is, and that if right and wrong were as easy as putting them in two separate columns, none of us would ever get in a mess, really. So.
Yeah, please.
Just a very simple question, Jo. You've selected. This is a very simple question, and I'm certainly going to buy your book because it looks absolutely amazing, and I want to learn. But it's curious. You're British, aren't you?
Yes.
Why did you select to only photograph Americans.
I couldn't get any British people to speak out.
Now,
So
one
I
has to ask, why is everything closed here? I'm a
Yeah.
Yank. I've been living here 30 years. And I find it curious, Ben, you said that there's only a few of your colleagues and countrymen that have been able to not have even if they do have a gag order, that have come forward. And here is Joe that had to go to America and photograph Americans that were more open than us here in the UK. I find that a tragedy.
It was something that came up again and again, and I was really shocked. And I had a naive view that we're a little bit more liberal and we have a freer press over here, and that we question ourselves and question our government and our actions. And I was wrong, maybe. I know I get confused about the technicalities of it, but whistleblowing in America up until the Bradley Manning case, you were allowed to whistleblow, and it was part of the Constitution, I think. Whereas here, we were talking about this the other day, and I've forgotten the name of it, but here whistleblowing is not supported and is illegal. So people, it is in it's not supported in the same way that it is in America, and there is a huge movement in America, whereas here the British military does not question itself ever. And I can only say this from the experience that I've had of trying to get people to speak out, and there are hundreds and hundreds of US soldiers that have spoken out in one way or another. And it's changing now because of the Bradley Manning case. The laws have been changed drastically in the last year or so.
It's important to understand as well that they're two very different cultures, the British military and the American military. The American military, stating the obvious, is huge. The British military is very small, and the way the British military operates is it creates these families called regiments, and within those regiments it creates smaller families of companies and platoons, and these guys spend a lot of time together. And there's this culture of not of anyone outside of that being an outsider and not to be trusted. And so there's not the connection between the British soldier and the British population that there is between the American soldier and the American population. Adnan was saying to me just yesterday, like, if you've got an Iraq medal in America and you tell anyone about it in a pub, they'll buy you a drink. In Britain, that's a completely different culture. And also we've got a class culture that's different. So British soldiers, there's still that. The officers are drawn from the upper middle classes and the upper class and the public school boys, and the soldiers are drawn from the poor areas of the country, the north, Scotland, Wales, Ireland. And these people aren't encouraged in their normal daily lives to speak out either. So there's cultural differences, I think, and it is complex, but I think there's a lot to do with that.
The other big difference is that there's a part-time military in America, and so a lot of people will join to get their college money, and so in Britain there's a much more sort of committed, career-driven soldiers, whereas in America there's a lot of young men that were agreeing to sign up for a certain amount of time so that they can get their college money. So they have a different sort of commitment to the military, and therefore able to speak out in a different way. So I think it's a combination of lots of different things.
Do we have any more questions? Okay, I'll take these two, and then I think that will be time to wrap it up. Please.
Hi, I'm Tom. So it's basically for two of you. So you went to the US and talked to US personnel, and you're from Britain. But there are other countries, so Canada, Australia, New Zealand, loads of European countries. Have you come across other troops from other nationalities? Yes, like UK and the US have got the most out there. Therefore, there's going to be the more cases across the board. But have you come across Canadians, Australians with the same kind of stories?
I didn't. I was also just trying to contain the project financially, so if it was just too far away. I met people that had sought asylum in Canada and in Germany, but I didn't speak to other nationalities. Did you?
There have been other cases. I'm pretty sure there's a German officer at the minute who's, I seem to remember he's in court for some form of resistance. But I suppose the difference is that this is a lot of these people have spoken out publicly. But there are lots of people within the British military, Australian, New Zealand military, who carry out acts of resistance, but we'll never know about them. So, for example, I was on a helicopter once, and a guy had his hands bound so tightly that his hands were like ballooning with blood, and my mate next to me cut the plastic cuffs off, which is something he should never have done, you know. So there's these tiny acts of resistance that we will never know about, and there's stories of New Zealanders who refuse to hand their prisoners over to certain units because they know they're going to be tortured, and there's all of these stories come out. And I mean, the big one, I suppose, for in terms of similarities with these guys would be the guys in Turkey and Israel, where there is conscription and there's huge resistance to the deploying to Gaza, deploying to the West Bank, deploying to Kurdistan, the Kurdish regions of Turkey. So, so it is prevalent in other countries. But yeah, you're right. I think it's America where it seems to be a bigger phenomenon.
Thank you. My name's James. Question to Jo, a photographic question on your choice of using film over digital, and perhaps you could tell us about why that is.
I shoot digitally as well, but I love film, and it stops me looking at the back of the screen and constantly looking at a 2D image on the back of the screen. I shoot on a Hasselblad, and so I look through, and it means that I concentrate on what's happening right here, right now, rather than worrying about the still images that are popping up on the back of the screen. So it makes me much more controlled, and I can't waste film. So yeah, it just gives me discipline, I guess, is the reason. So.
I'm glad we got a photographic question. Yes, please.
A question for you, Jo. I wanted to know what happened to those guys now.
Put the mic.
Oh, sorry. What happened to those guys that you photograph now? Have they been able to find a job, or are they living a normal life? Or
it's a real mix. Some haven't and are struggling and suffering the consequences of what happened. One of them went AWOL to Canada and had a life in Canada and had a child, and then was extradited back to America. So he now can't see his child, who's still in Canada, and is struggling with the fees and the costs of being taken to court. Whereas other people have had such clarity and found a new purpose in life, and have set up lots of sort of veterans organisations. And one guy does a workshop for veterans to sort of process how they're feeling after leaving the military, and they shred their military uniforms and make paper, and then do pieces of artwork on the book. So it's really varied. Some people have gone and become a lawyer for big corporations. It's a real mix. But and then other ones like Sam in this picture rejoined the military. So so a real mix.
Well, I think we'll end it there with a very big thank you to both our speakers. It's been such an interesting evening, and again, huge congratulations on pulling off this work, and very good luck in trying to change the world.
Do please stay and buy a copy of the book from Ellen over here. I don't know, how much is it, Ellen? £30. A bargain.